Hello, welcome to the Scaleup Leader this week. This week we're talking about why your company needs a chief of staff. Now, obviously this is for scale up situations and scale up executives. When do you need a chief of staff? Why do you need a chief of staff, and so on? And to help us in this conversation, I'd like to welcome my friend Dora Nagy. I met Dora at Google many years ago, and we rode to Paris together as well. Oh, sorry, from Paris to London. But I mean, we met at Google, right? We met at Google Transit.
Yeah, hi, Richard. Yeah, I think we've known each other for over 10 years, which is kind of crazy. And yeah, we met.
I've aged, but you haven't. So,
like all the cycling, right? Like keeps us all. I met at Google. I was in London, and then shortly after moved to New York and then the Valley. And I think we reconnected, as you said, cycling from Paris to London, I think 2-3 years ago. So a lot of good conversations, I think, come out of, sweating together with a team, hiking or cycling. For sure, I had some experience with that.
Yeah. Oh, actually, let me just press record here. I forgot to do that one thing that I said that I was going to do, which was press record. There we go. I'm going to record that. Anyway, we met during that period, and since then you went from marketing at Google, and then you did some strategy work at Google, and then SoftBank chief of staff, and now then chief of staff at Kheiron, and now you do consulting and so on. One of the questions that I had that I really think is interesting is what is a chief of staff? And I asked this question because one of the reasons I was at Amazon and for a couple of years, and people had there was this role there called technical advisor, and I'd ask people, what's a technical advisor? And they'd say, well, it's like a chief of staff, and that didn't really help me much. But what is a chief of staff, and why do you need one?
Yeah. This is actually a really good question. And I think there's a lot of confusion about what is a chief of staff. There's also different understanding, I think, in Europe, where it's still relatively new compared to the US, where it's been around. So, originally it comes from military. So there was a right-hand person who made sure that the camp is all organized and, everybody is ready and, they know what they're doing. And then later on, you saw in the politicians, the president, like United States, they would have a chief of staff. And, it continued to be this sort of right-hand person that is trusted within the circle. They are almost as powerful as their boss, that I'm going to call principal, for simplicity. And so after a while, companies started, having a chief of staff. So the big companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, you could see the role popping up in the Valley, and then others started sort of hiring that person in the Valley, and then now I think in Europe. The simplest way I think about it is really a range from like 1 to 10. All those people could be called of staff, but one is really someone who is more like a super good executive assistant, who can really help their founder, CEO, principal, let's just call them principal, to really focus, get stuff done, be organized. And then the other end of the spectrum, you have 10, which is someone who is really strong in strategy and operations. And so in some companies, it's almost equivalent to the COO. And sometimes you could see that person growing into a COO role, for example, if they are in that end. And you see everything in between, which is quite hard when you hire.
Like a level one chief of staff is like executive assistant plus. Is that what you're saying? And then a level 10 is like a COO minus.
Yeah. So when you
right?
see quite a lot in between, and that's why when someone hiring a chief of staff, it's quite useful to understand which one they actually need. If they need one to begin with, right? Because then you can hire someone who's not the right person for the role or for the stage of the company. So those are important things to just understand a little bit more, like what do you actually need when you say, I need a chief of staff.
So this really comes down to what level of chief of staff do I need, and then who do I hire for that chief of staff? You're not necessarily just saying some chiefs of staff are more senior than others. It's very much a matter of like, what do I need, and then how do I find the person that fits that role? Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And, sometimes, I find I work with a lot of founders and they think, oh, I'm so overwhelmed. I just need help. Like, let me hire a chief of staff because my buddy has a chief of staff and they're just going to come in and just do stuff. But actually, it's worth really thinking it through, because you might need someone super junior. And sometimes those people can also be called a founder's associate, which is really just a junior person, maybe out of college, eager to do a lot of stuff, follow you around, learn from you, just be in the business and just learn. And they help you out, right? But maybe you need someone who's a lot more senior, and you need somebody who is almost like, your trusted strategy and ops person. Maybe you don't even have a COO, but you need that kind of background and experience. You might hire from management consulting, and that person becomes part of that executive team that's helping you with strategic decisions as well.
So what is the difference? Sorry, what is the difference between a COO and a chief of staff then? Like, a great chief of staff and a COO, what's the difference?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think oftentimes you see those roles being very similar. So it's really coming down to sort of how do you divide and conquer. But typically a COO would have direct reports, and they have deliverables, and they have reports, a team that they manage. They often have maybe finance or operations or, facilities or reviews, like all those things report into them. A chief of staff is typically an individual contributor. They might have like a mini-me, like a junior associate report to them, or maybe the EA reports to them, but they typically an individual contributor. And they choose the role to get to know the business. So they stay in the role for like a year, maybe a year and a half, and they typically move on to a function. So they become maybe head of people, or they become head of marketing, depending on the interest and the background of the person. So you don't really see a chief of staff sort of staying in a chief of staff role for years to come in the same company.
Right. So is it a good entry to a company? Someone to get to know the whole company, and then you have context for everything, you have relationships, and then we move on to a functional role perhaps, and then you already have this background of breadth, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And also sometimes you see someone internally raising their hand and say, hey, I would love to do more, and I don't really know yet where I want to be in the company, but I really love the company, I love the founders, I just want to do more, can I take this role? And sometimes, when people ask me who should I hire, I actually suggest hiring someone into the role that you already worked with, because then you know how good they are, you know their style, if you have that sort of trusted relationship. So it's a bit like, when you're marrying someone, you kind of want to have dated. So bringing in a completely new person, and now you are my, most trusted ally in the company, that could be a bit difficult. But it's a great way for someone junior to get into the role if they're good and they want to learn, and then stay in that role and then move out to, okay, maybe it's going to be head of operations.
Yeah. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I know that you have this sort of framework for helping people understand what is a chief of staff. You have these 5 Ps.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's yours or the institution of chiefs of staff, or whatever, whoever it is. But I mean, what is this? What exactly does a chief of staff do? Like, how do we understand this as someone who hasn't really come across the role before?
Yeah, and there are different versions of it, and I sort of created my own version. But there's a couple of core things that typically a chief of staff would do. And the 5 Ps would be 1, priorities. So helping the founder, CEO, or the principal to really nail down what is the focus for the business, for the company. What are the things that really matter? So whether your next milestone is a fundraise, or you try to get to an IPO, or you try to get to an exit, like what are those 3-5 things maybe that really going to move the needle so that your business, your company is going to succeed. Then the second P is planning. So how are you going to get there? And that's where you bring in OKRs, which I think you and I agree on, that it's not just filling out a spreadsheet, because anyone can do that, but how do you actually translate those priorities into plans that people can agree on, and they can have the right conversations in the right sequence, so they come to a solid plan that's actually executable. Then you have the third P, which is performance. So you often find chief of staff managing OKRs, or whatever you have, KPIs, and make sure that the business and the individuals know how we are doing. Like, are we behind? Like, what's the issue? Like, how the teams are performing. And they really are on top of those metrics and KPIs to make sure that they can keep the company honest and keep the company on track. And then the fourth one would be people. So oftentimes you see projects popping up such as, okay, what's our leveling framework, and how do we create, progression plan in the company, and how does it tie to performance management and raises and promotions? You have some sort of things that a head of people would typically do, and you see sometimes chief of staff partnering with the head of people, and then they work on these projects together. And then the fifth is, which is sort of projects, which we call the special projects, whatever is on the mind of the principal. So might be, I don't know, organize an executive retreat, or we want to acquire a company. I need someone on point to manage that project. So the chief of staff would pick these typically strategic, important projects for the company, and they make sure that those are delivered and executed to that quality that the principal needs.
Yeah. Okay. So right. And how does it, like, in some ways, some of these things sound like you said, with people in particular, you have a chief people officer or a head of HR or whatever. And some of these things like planning and performance sounds like either a people thing or a individual manager thing or a CEO thing or a principal thing, I guess. Why do they need a chief of staff to do this? Like, what's the real need here? What's the thing that makes me think I need someone else to do this instead of me, or instead of people?
Yeah, so honestly, the most true answer is that because this principal needs someone who gets what's in their head. They get the quality, they get the vision, they get the spirit of what the principal wants. And so they need this trusted person in the mix to ensure that the principal gets what they want at the end. And also remember, the chief of staff doesn't really have a skin in the game compared to the other department heads, because others all have, teams and their own, agendas and interests. And, they naturally try to sort of play, the game so that they get what they want at the end. The chief of staff is almost like, United Nations across everyone. However, their loyalty primarily lies with the principal. So they're always going to have the principal's interest at heart, regardless of any internal politics or power games or who is right, who is wrong, etc. So if it's a good, strong chief of staff, the principal can really benefit from having that person and, as they say, being the eyes and the ears into the business.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ways I think I've thought about it when I've learned about this role is partially just about having the bandwidth. You have a high bandwidth with one-on-one with the principal, and then because the principal is often busy doing other things that involve, especially the CEO, but they're often involved with executives, or with the board, or with investors, or with customers, or something like that, and they have to spend quite a lot of time on that external facing part of the role. And even if you're internal, you have quite a lot of internal, working with stakeholders that has to happen upwards and across management, I guess you'd call that. Because the chief of staff can have more time available to, first of all, mind meld, and then secondly, spend the time sort of explaining that or getting the rest of the team aligned. It's sort of like a second pair of hands to do that management more than the upwards and outward stuff. Would that be right? Is that a sensible understanding of things?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think about the evolution of a founder who becomes a CEO, and even within that role they are a manager first and then they become a leader, there's some evolution there. So some people who start out with like 4 or 5 people, when they find themselves doing everything and knowing everything, and they realize after a while it's not sustainable. So you can't be in the same place and operate in the same way when you have already 50 people, let alone 100 people, 150. So you actually need leverage, and you need a scalable leverage. And that person is the chief of staff. And the really good chief of staffs recognize what is your strength, and make sure you spend most of your time on those things. So you don't spend your time on other stuff that could be outsourced, or someone else could manage it, or the chief of staff could manage it. And that sort of reality check that the chief of staff can give you around, okay, do you really need to be in this? Or, is this really that important? Or just being, holding up the mirror. Okay, we said these are the priorities. Why are you spending all your time? I'm looking your week. Like, you're spending your time doing all the other stuff. Like, you're not focusing on the things that actually matter. So in that sense, absolutely right. The person is the leverage, but in a sort of smart way. That's a constant sort of reality check around, okay, are you doing the things you are best at? And that actually matter for this business.
There's quite a lot of coaching involved in that then.
Yeah. I mean, I love, coaching, and I did my sort of coaching certification as well. So sometimes I show up as a mentor. So, okay, I have been there, done that. Let me help you. Let me give you the answer. But sometimes I show up as a coach, and I really help people have the most important conversations that they need to have with themselves. So I'm there sort of, coaching and trying to nudge and hold up the mirror. But you need someone who is open to it, right? And wants to get feedback and wants to get better and grow.
Yeah, interesting. And you mentioned actually in our previous conversation, we talked a little bit about this, well, I guess for this kind of two parts to this whole thing, but we did this question. You were the chief of staff to a COO, and then later on of SoftBank, and then chief of staff to CEO of Kheiron. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Is there a difference between being chief of staff to different kinds of roles? And then we also talked a bit about the principle, like, the quality of the principle makes the most difference to your success and how that works. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think there's a difference between being a chief of staff in a big established company, like a Fortune 500 company, where you have a lot of the processes, done, it's a well-oiled machine, you have strong leaders in the functions. There, being a chief of staff, you're probably going to have someone who's a bit more senior, a bit more experienced, because they're going to run a lot of cross-functional projects. You compare this to a startup where maybe there's 50 people, 40 people under that. I don't really see chief of staff. So I would say you have a founder's associate. That's perfectly enough. But as you start scaling sort of Series A, Series B, you bring in a chief of staff because you don't really have well-oiled processes, and there are no best practices, and the company is growing out of this child sort of phase or teenager phase to want to become an adult. And so you need a person to come in and then figure out, okay, how can we streamline things, how can we bring efficiency, how can we set up certain ways of operating and even thinking. Like, there's a lot of mindset shift that needs to happen as the company is growing up. So a chief of staff can help with that kind of mindset shift. For example, let's not task manage, micromanage everyone, but start managing towards outcomes. And, let's bring in OKRs, and let's have a modus operandi. Like, what's the cadence to the business? So you kind of do different things, and you need different backgrounds and different personality even, because some people enjoy the sort of earlier stage growing out of the chaos, and some people love the the machine and things running and it's efficient, and I'm just coming in and like doing interesting projects on top of everything.
Yeah, so like, I guess that really also makes a difference who your principal is, right? Because you're in a startup with 50 people, 200 people, whatever, you're going to be chief of staff to the CEO, because it doesn't make sense to have multiple chiefs of staff, I guess. I never
smaller startups, like I never see multiple chief of staffs versus big companies. I know Google now, I think almost every VP has a chief of staff. So that's a new thing in the last 5 years, because they just realize that it helps them tremendously to be more effective in their own teams. But one thing that you mentioned is the relationship between the principal and the chief of staff, and that's actually often underestimated, like how important that trusted relationship is. The principal needs to trust the chief of staff. They need to support them, back them up in a way that they maybe not even do with their co-founder or like other execs, and sort of vice versa. So they really have to be a close, very strong team, supporting each other. So without that support and trust, the chief of staff is disempowered. So nobody's going to take it seriously. They just think, okay, whatever, I'm just going to go to the CEO anyway. So, don't bother, get out of the way. So you need to have that really strong, explicit trust and connection that people can also in the company understand and respect the chief of staff, that they are representing the principal.
So that strong connection with the principal, because that's the value that you then build the relationship and the trust with your staff. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Because if the staff doesn't respect the chief of staff, they don't believe that the principal trusts them and empower them, then why would they even listen to the chief of staff? They just completely skip them and then go to the principal directly and work with them.
And this is a good way of jumping into that whole topic of the mistakes that companies make with chief of staff, what mistakes chief of staff make, or mistakes principal make with chief of staff. I mean, do you have any examples of these kinds of mistakes, the things that go wrong?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, hiring the wrong person, I think that's quite a big one. So if you hire the wrong chief of staff, it's just not working. You didn't think about the level you need. You hired a too senior or maybe a too junior person. And also you yourself as a principal, you haven't really thought through how you want to use your chief of staff. And so, or you don't want to have, you don't want to spend time with them, right? Like you just think, okay, they just go off and do their own thing. That's not going to work. So you need to have a very clear picture on what kind of level I want, what kind of background and experience I want. Do I want someone who is going to amplify me, or do I want someone who will complement me, for example? And you hire the right person. So if you don't have the right person, it's good to just, I believe fire, fast and just get the right person in, or maybe just, move them into another role in the company. That's always a better option, because there must be something that they can do well, right? It's just that role for some reason doesn't work out. I think that's for a principal, that could be a mistake, hire the wrong person. The other mistake is, I think, not empowering them. So not giving that trust and time and attention, and just hoping that, they will just go and thrive without all that, because that's just not realistic.
Have you seen the problem, like we talked a little bit before about, some people treating the chief of staff like an executive assistant, right? Which is a really valid and useful functional role. It's really, okay, having an assistant is fantastic, but if you hire a chief of staff and then treat them like an assistant, is that a kind of error that happens, and how do you counter that?
Yeah, I mean, I have seen that. I think in that case, the question is, do you actually need a chief of staff, or you need a rock star EA? Because you could get a really good, strong EA who can do other projects in addition to their, typical EA work, in which case you don't really need a chief of staff. So why pay someone that you don't really need if your EA can do it? Or maybe you need to hire a better EA. And it's a much better configuration. I think for, chief of staffs, it's not very wise to do the EA job, because if, people around them see them as, oh, it's basically an EA job with a glorified title. Again, nobody's going to take that person that seriously as a chief of staff. Also, in general,
does it make sense to have both then?
Say that again?
Does it make sense for a principal to have both an EA and a chief of staff? Like, is that a good solution to that problem?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But the roles have to be very, different and understood. So understood what the EA does, and then the chief of staff actually does the chief of staff job. So there's a big difference between the two roles if you play it well, and they can really help each other. So the chief of staff can rely on the EA where they need to. So for anything around the principal that the EA can support is super helpful for the chief of staff, because then they can focus on the high impact, high value add and initiatives.
Yeah. Oh, cool. One of the things we were talking about, one of the reasons why, I was keen to talk to you about this actually, is that I help exec teams with OKRs, and frequently enough, the person that I relate to is the chief of staff. But that's one of the people who either works with me to help their staff, and I'm an external consultant. I help give them OKRs, and I coach manage the team on things and stuff like that, and then they hand over to the chief of staff, or the chief of staff is just my main point of contact. Potentially the chief of staff bringing me in, and in some situations, as you said, the chief of staff actually does the OKR implementation, and hence they don't need someone like me, which is fine. But I mean, like I'm trying to understand, like, what is it that you would do in those situations? Like, do you work how should someone external work with the chief of staff in these situations when you kind of got that slight overlap? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, totally. And I have done projects where I did have a strong chief of staff in the business I could work with. And that's usually one of my first questions. Okay, do you actually have a chief of staff I can work with, or do you have a head of ops? Or, okay, do you have a great EA if you don't have any of those? Because it really helps that you as a consultant, you bring a very specific skill set and experience into the business. Yeah. And chief of staffs are fantastic generalists, and they have a lot of knowledge and the right kind of thinking and attitude, but maybe they haven't had those experiences that a consultant can bring in. And so then you just work with them very closely, and whatever the project is, and it actually really helps to have a chief of staff in the business, because the principal is probably not going to be as available as a chief of staff. But I think as a consultant, it definitely makes life much easier when there's a chief of staff and that person can work with the consultants. And it's easier for the principal as well, because they don't have to sort of engage with the consultants that much time.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've had a couple of experiences where I've worked with a great chief of staff who has been a massive amplifier for the effect, the impact, and just made things happen without from my what I do, I really do need to relate often directly to the CEO as well. But having the chief of staff to help make it happen has been really helpful.
Yeah. And sometimes I coach chief of staffs as well, because they might not have had that experience, but they're keen to learn. So as long as they are sort of open-minded, they don't feel intimidated by, my God, this, person is coming in and gonna make me stupid for whatever reason. That's a really good partnership, because you can actually help them to be better chief of staffs, and you can, help them understand some of the pitfalls and mistakes that, you have done or seen before. So they're not gonna make all those mistakes again. So
it's you working as a coach for chief of staff, is that right?
Yeah, so I work with founders, but sometimes the chief of staff will ping me. It's like, okay, I'm new to the job, never done this before. Like, can you just help me with shortcuts, the answer? I don't want to figure it out. Next 6 months, 9 months, etc. Just give me the answer.
When should someone come to you instead of hiring a chief of staff? Like, if a founder comes to you, would you be like, I know in this situation you should hire someone permanently as a chief of staff, or yes, I'll do some coaching for you for some time, and then the outcome of that is that you'll probably hire a chief of staff? Or is that what you do? Is that how it works?
Yeah, so sometimes I work with founders who do have a chief of staff, which is great, because I can work with them as well, and they can just implement everything that we're working on together. Sometimes they don't have one, and so they come, I work with them, and the outcome is, yes, you need a chief of staff, and I can help you understand what kind of chief of staff you actually need, and maybe I can help you hire one if I have someone good in my network. Sometimes the outcome, I have conversations where the outcome is that you don't actually need a chief of staff at this point where you are with your business. Probably 9 months, 12 months down the line, I think you will need one, but then there's enough time to actually think about what kind of chief of staff you need, and you don't hire someone now that maybe you regret 12 months later, because it's going to be a different profile that you would want to have in 12 months time.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay. We talked also about OKRs. I mean, obviously, I do OKRs. That's my whole business, and I work mostly with founders of growth stage startups, so to help them, founders and exec teams really of growth stage startups. I work doing that, and you've done the same kinds of things. And so I'd love to talk to you about your experiences in when that's worked really well and when it's worked really badly. In terms of how that relates to the sort of priorities and planning part, because priorities and planning are kind of like so closely related with OKRs. You have the 5 things you mentioned, or I've got them here: priorities, planning, performance, people, and projects. And I'm quite opinionated about some of these things, especially as they relate to OKRs and so on. But what's your experiences of when do OKRs help, and when did they work well for you in the organizations? When have you seen it not working, and how does that relate to your role?
Yeah, I mean, I have implemented, OKRs, back at Google, I was basically running the, well-oiled machine once it was sort of set up, and so in the business organization, getting everyone, it was back in the day, I think 16,000 people across the org to align on, okay, what are we doing next quarter? But, that's a big company, it's established, you have high quality leaders, who know what they're doing. So it's quite different than, okay, there's a team of, I don't know, 40, 50, they never done anything like this. And okay, where do you start, or what's right, what's wrong for them? And I think what oftentimes people miss is, OKRs is a framework, but it's really just a framework to help, having the right conversations. And if you're not having the right conversations, at the executive level and then with the rest of the company, then it becomes this sort of like spreadsheet filling, tracking exercise. And I have seen, I really feel for them, chief of staffs pulling their hair when they're doing dashboard after dashboard, cascading, more dashboard. Everybody's exhausted. And then they're like, we hate OKRs, these don't work. And the founder says, okay, here's the 3 things I want to do. I'm done. And so when it becomes this like massive, like cascading, everything goes to, Monday.com, whatever, Asana, or any KPI, tracker, or into Notion, these are all fantastic tools, but designed for different purposes. And so when I see things getting really lost in, okay, what's the tool, what's the software, is the point around, okay, can we just sit down for an hour and talk about what is going to move the needle for this business? And that's a really good exercise I always do with any like exec team, with the founders in the room, or, in a virtual room. And you can do this in your next team meeting when you have it. Is you just basically ask, as the founder, CEO, or principal, you just ask your executive team, okay, get a piece of paper, we are all on Zoom, whatever, nobody's cheating, everybody's looking at their piece of paper, just write down the 3 things that actually matter for this business between now and, next milestone, and you insert whatever that is, whether it's fundraising or an exit or an IPO, whatever it is. And you just get everyone to write down the top 3 things. And then they're all going to show it like at the same time. And you will see like how different like people think about what actually matters. Now, if you can't even agree with your closest circle of execs on what are the things that really matter for this business, there's no way you can implement any OKR, any system, because the fundamental thing is, okay, can we agree on what matters for this business? Do we understand why those things matter for this business? And how realistic we think those things are between, now and whatever the milestone is? Because once you have those conversations and agreements, then, okay, bring in the OKRs and let's put it into a spreadsheet or whatever you want to put it in.
I mean, this is interesting. So like quite a lot of people I talk to about OKRs are on that mindset of let's have the perfected writing things down system, and let's cascade everything and link them together, and then let's put it into a dashboard so we've got moving lines and graphs and things like that. And especially when you come from the software side, now, though, I think there are software that really work well. There are software platforms that really work well, but they tend to be focused on the conversation. Like, how do we drive a conversation as opposed to the data and the dashboard? But you have a piece of software that's focused on the data and like putting it in there, especially technically minded people, which most people in startups, even if they're not software developers, people in startups tend to have a technical mind, or tend to have an interest in this kind of technology. We tend to get obsessed with this stuff, and we instrument things, and we have dashboards, and we get excited about them. But what's really going on here is that conversation, and that exercise you mentioned about, like, let's everyone write down what the most important things is. And if the exec team can't agree on that, I'm just going to say it again, but if the exec team can't agree on that, how on earth are 50 or 100 or 1,000 other people going to agree on this? And how on earth is that going to play out in your actual daily life of the work? I mean, what happens in that situation is, if it's ambiguous at all, then everyone else is going to make their own decisions, or else not make decisions. Nothing will happen, or else they'll make their own decisions. And then you've got across this organization 15 different strategies being executed in effect. And then of course it's not going to work. And this is where I think that whole, make sure you have the conversation. Are you actually having that conversation, making decisions? Are you aligning on things? Is really important. And one thing I think as well you mentioned there about, like, having, we didn't make a video talking about people having disagreements. Like, it's not, I don't think it's necessary. I'm keen on your thoughts on this. I don't think it's necessary that everyone agrees. right? I do think it's necessary that we agree on what we've agreed, right? So if what I mean by this is that if we do ask that question of what's important and we have some different views, that can be really productive, that can be really helpful. Then we have a discussion about it and we figure out what we decide to do. And maybe one or two people or quite a few people still different, they still have a different opinion. But then Amazon had this principle, disagree and commit. Like you come to a point where you have to say, okay, I disagree with this. However, the team, the CEO, the founder, the principal, whoever it is we're going in this direction. We've decided as a group. I still disagree with this decision, but I'm going to commit to executing it as well as we can. And I'm going to commit to helping the rest of the organization execute it as well as we can. And I guess if someone, especially at the exec level, doesn't agree to commit, then the best thing is to get off the bus. I don't know what your thoughts on that are, but it's kind of like,
Absolutely.
there's no point in having someone, especially in the exec team, who is trying to go in a different direction.
Yeah, then they can go off and start their own company, right? If they want to sort of do things their own way. But if you know the 5 functions of a team, I think there's a famous book by Patrick Lencioni, if I pronounce his name well. I think when I read at YouTube, I think at some point it was like a must read. We all got it because it's like, okay, the 5 levels. And I think what you mentioned, I think levels 3 or 4, where, okay, we are one team. So even if we disagree sometimes, we commit and then we go out and make that happen, right? So it's an interesting one. Again, fundamentally is that level is trust, and then you have all these other layers to it.
Yeah. That's that whole disagreement. But the thing is that that's very different to it's my way or the highway, right? Because it's quite a to me these concepts are quite different. The my way or the highway is like, I've decided we're doing this, doesn't matter what you think. But the disagree and commit concept is, here's what we have a discussion, we have this conversation, as we talked about, a conversation about what to do. We discuss things, we take the input, we find the disagreement, we discuss the disagreement, we explore it, and then at some point in time we still have to make a decision. It's quite different to that sort of authoritarian, or that's not a word for this, but I'm trying to know what word is. But that authoritarian, this is what we're doing, never mind what you think, is very different to disagreeing, where we do have that conversation.
It reminds me also, I think you had a good post about this idea of being a servant leader, which I think again gets quite misunderstood, because sometimes I find some founders thinking, oh, I need to have more democracy and I want to make sure everybody feels included and everybody is heard, which is all beautiful and nice, but sometimes the wrong decisions are made because it's made as a democracy. And as a leader, you want to make sure everybody feels included and being part of the conversation. But ultimately, you need to make the decisions that drive to the results that you need to get to. So sometimes you need to have that sort of, disagree but commit situation. And especially with inexperienced founders, leaders who maybe never led a team before, there's a lot of these, popular ideas coming up, the servant leadership, etc. That, okay, beautiful ideas, but you have to get the result. You have to get to the next fundraise. You have to get to the next milestone. So how can you sort of balance those things? And, a good chief of staff can also observe these things, and good chief of staffs typically have a very high EQ and be able to get the dynamics, the subtleties, the unsaid things, and can really help a founder in that journey to be more sort of self-aware and become a better person and a leader as well.
I mean, that's quantitative leadership thing. When I posted that, I got what I expected, which was some sort of controversy from some people who have a different opinion. But I mean, from my point of view, servant leadership is super important. It's a fantastic way of getting things done, but it has to come secondary to results. And that whole concept of like, you've got to figure out, someone posted the comment, what was that? Results first, team always, right? In the response to this. And I kind of agree with this. It's one of those things where you're at risk of diluting the message if you say that. But I mean, results first is really, we're trying to get the results. And the best way of getting the results is often to serve the team and make sure the team is being looked after. And if people aren't feeling looked after or served, then they don't tend to engage very well in delivering the results. But if you just serve the team, you get nothing. And that's a disaster. That's actually not even serving the team anyway. But yeah, this whole sort of concept is a tough one, especially in Europe. I find, because one of the things that I've noticed is different with, and I don't know whether you've worked a great deal with European companies as opposed to US and Anglo, but I mean, certainly my experience with US and Anglo countries is that not necessarily hierarchical, but they're more comfortable than at least the Germanic companies that I work with tend to have a very consensus, and Nordic and Scandinavian countries tend to have a very consensus-driven approach where we all have to agree before we go forward, and until we agree, we don't do it. And that's sort of a natural thing that happens in some companies. And a consensus thing, it can be not just democratic. Like sometimes you have democratic where it's like, well, I'm not making a decision until we've got a majority. But this is very much like until we have a consensus, yeah, and it's quite different. Do you have experience working with companies that have a different kind of culture? Where how do you balance the consensus culture with progress?
I mean, working, a couple of years with, within SoftBank, it's Japanese company culture. When you go to Japan, you see very different ways of being and working, while still being, in Silicon Valley, which is where I work with people in the Valley who are used to that sort of Google culture. So you go from one that's very, let's challenge each other, let's just, have a great debate, let's just question everything, let's just not accept, how things been done to date, to another culture where you're really not supposed to challenge your superior. So you are disrespectful if you do that. And there's a reason why, things have been done in a certain way. And there is appreciation for that sort of tradition and that way of thinking. So I think I have seen sort of pretty much both extremes, like all has, pros and cons, of course.
One of the advantages of a chief of staff, I think, of this is this also happens as a coach and consultant, an external person, is you can go and ask that question and get that disagreement from someone where in that kind of culture, the CEO can't always get that directly.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always, that's why, oftentimes I feel like companies bring in the expensive consulting firms as well, because it's easier to, point at them that, okay, they asked the question, they suggested this thing, than someone internally challenging them or disagreeing with even maybe with the CEO or the other execs, right?
Yeah. I would say I'm not that expensive, but that depends on the consulting firm. Hey, we've had a comment from someone. This is not a question, it's just a comment. Jason says, I need to move into other things for the day, but very much hope you make the recording available. Yes, it will be available. It will be available on LinkedIn and YouTube. We'll also probably do some cuts out of this to sort of post at various times, and you'll be able to find that. Great topic and great discussion so far. So thanks, Jason, for the comment. I think it's always interesting to see what people are doing and that they're interested in following this. Funny enough, on this system, I don't know, I don't think you can see this, Dora, but on my screen I can see the number of viewers. But weirdly enough, the number of viewers in this application says 0. Every time I do this, I go somewhere else. I go afterwards, and it says 23 or some number. So it's kind of weird. I know there are people there. If you're here and you'd like to make a comment, you'd like to ask a question, you can ask a question to me or to Dora. Just post a question on LinkedIn or YouTube, and we can get to that. Although it is coming up to sort of the end of the conversation, but feel free to stick something there. And anyway, we will go back over it later on, and if there's anything that you've asked, I'm sure we'll be able to find a way of sending that message back and somehow answering the question, whatever it is. But anyway, just I guess sort of we've sort of talked a lot about this whole pros and planning. How is and how chief of staff works with all sort of stuff, and how OKRs work and all that sort of stuff. Do you have experiences of like OKR implementations that went badly that you think that would be worth sharing? Because I mean, I do, but I mean,
I have seen, when I see these monster spreadsheets and dashboards and sitting in meetings with the principal where they look quite surprised, like why are we even talking about these priorities? I have completely different priorities, and see people have been working on those for weeks, and there's a complete disconnect between what the principal is thinking in their heads versus what the team understood. And actually, one thing I see is a very slippery slope, founder, CEO thinking, my vision is so clear. It's so straightforward. It's so obvious. Like everybody should know that and understand that. And maybe they can even point to an occasion, maybe once a quarter or, maybe once a year, they share that. And there's a genuine belief that it's clear to everyone. And I often compare this to, like, you know, when you have kids, like, you assume they know that you love them, but you don't just tell them you love them once a quarter, right? So
Yeah.
you sort of repeat and repeat and repeat. And so when I see sort of CEOs, founders not really having those conversations and internal comms and just, you know, talking about their vision and the strategy and how those are linked, and therefore what does execution need to look like, when those conversations aren't happening, you know, OKRs is just a painful, completely, it's kind of useless process, because then it's just like KPIs and spreadsheets and dashboards. So those types of implementations, you know, if you're not clear on what is your priorities, what's your strategy and why, and you don't have those regular conversations with your team, then all the other stuff becomes kind of irrelevant, because it's so, you know, separate from what's actually in your head as a founder CEO.
But my experience is, like, in terms of like how to solve that problem, or how to make sure that doesn't happen, one of the things that I've found is that OKRs are kind of like you have to have a strategy and a vision first, and then the OKRs come out of that. The way, like, I read this book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. I really like the way you approach, which is strategy is a diagnosis of what the current situation is, so we all agree on what the current problems are, what the current driver for our strategy, then a guiding policy of what we're trying to do, and we communicate what that is. And if that guiding policy happens to be a 45-page PowerPoint deck, it's probably not clear enough, but it's probably not maybe clear enough policy. You need to make it sort of like crisp and sort of like focused as a policy. But then the outcome of that is that you then have a series of coordinated actions, like this coherent sort of framework of actions that you're going to carry out to implement that. And that's all part of the strategy. Once you have that clear, then writing your OKRs is actually not too hard, because what you're doing is you're figuring out, well, what are the most important things to do first? Like, what are the things we need to do now to get this done? And what I do find is that when you have a team, an exec team that is struggling to write their OKRs, it's often because they don't really align or know what their strategy is. And not always, but I mean, often that's the case. We just don't know what the strategy is. And the other situation that can happen sometimes, especially when you take the OKR system a bit too literally and do it too much bottom up, is you get all of this input and people set objectives in all over the company, but it doesn't create a strategy. It doesn't fit together in any sensible way, and it doesn't match with what it is in the CEO or the exec team.
Yeah. Actually, that's a very good one, because I see that happening where, again, it's a very natural way how people think. So you see functional leads who really focus on, okay, what is my team delivering? And they really want to focus on it and show it. And it's like, oh, we are so busy, and that's why I need to hire, 10 more people, and it's all the things we're doing. So people go into this mindset of like my team versus what is the cross-functional, what is the cross-company, focus. Yeah. And so that's where you as a principal can, balance that kind of thinking out. With, okay, let's actually think as a team. I know you are all busy and doing amazing things, and your teams are, delivering and working very hard, but, let's just put your team aside and your function aside, and let's think together, like, for this company, it's like our baby, like, what are the most important things? Because those are truly the good OKRs that become sort of, okay, what is the marketing person delivering? And then what is the legal team delivering? And what is the sales team delivering? Kind of disjointed. That's not really the essence of true cross-functional OKRs.
Yeah, exactly. So you get the whole company level OKRs that sort of cover, the broad range of what we're trying to do as a company. And then that gets interpreted into the teams that might go into a plan. What I usually recommend people do is write down their plan, whatever way they can. And some people are great at writing down plans, and some people are less great at it. That's okay. But I mean, you write down the plan in whatever mechanism it is, whether it's a Gantt chart or a one-pager or a series of user stories or whatever makes sense for you. And you write that down, but then you bring that back to the exec team and you sort of say, well, this is the marketing plan. And people you want to look at it, try and get everyone to understand what the marketing plan is. How does that relate to the objectives that we set as a team for the company, right? And what I want to do is I want to see the CTO understanding the marketing plan and asking dumb questions, but questions about marketing to understand it. Some of those questions are going to be questions that, like, well, the CTO is not a marketer, so they don't understand basic concepts of marketing, and that's okay. So at least you're educating them about this. But then the act of doing this then means that now we're together and we're sort of collaborating on a series of plans across the business that are going to result in these OKRs. And now everyone has some sense of ownership of this. And what I want to see is like the marketer looking at the product plan and the the finance person looking at the operational plan, and whatever else it is, like all these cross-functional conversations happen. The focus is this plan going to help us achieve that company objective, or are these plans working together? And by having these different points of view, you get a brains trust in that team, that sort of cross-functional brains trust that is able to sort of give those results.
And I think the tempting thing for like a principal could be to dive too much into those conversations and try to handhold and spoon feed. But the reality is, if your key execs aren't able to have those conversations together, they aren't able to think it through together, like, challenge each other, come to some answer, plus maybe one or two questions to then discuss with the principal. If you really have to dive in and you have to micromanage, or you have to send your chief of staff to almost work it out for them, I would question sort of whether you have the right people at that executive level, or maybe you need, other people to come in and maybe with more experience, more knowledge, because you shouldn't need to sort of go dive in too much and be part of those conversations. You want to be there at the end, and they all come, and then they all have had those conversations, and you can pressure test more things, and you're going to change a few things, and maybe they have thought of stuff you haven't thought about, which is the best thing. Then they are actually thinking, right? But if you have to really dive in, or your chief of staff is basically designing the marketing plan for the next year, probably something is off there.
But one of the common themes that I have with the companies that I work with is that there isn't this level of conversation that's happening among the execs. It's not just one person; it's like the whole team. It's like they're a little bit too siloed. They're a little bit too isolated. Maybe they feel insecure about their knowledge of cross-functional areas or whatever, or maybe they just haven't been put together. One of the things that I find is that through the OKR program that I usually work with them on, we spend a little bit of time on OKRs and quite a lot of time on team dynamics and how this works. And it ends up being an excuse for coaching, of getting people to raise the level of their work. I mean, people talk about a lot of the sort of leadership in career books or management books talk about people at that level, at whatever level you are, you need to be thinking the level above. And so if you're at that C level and you're a functional leader, most of your mind thinking kind of needs to be at the C level to being cross-functional and understanding everything. But that does not happen, especially as companies have grown up and people have come from a smaller background. They come from their function and they're absorbed in their function. And so you have to do some work to elevate their thinking to the company level. And OKRs are a great tool for doing that and for causing these conversations, and then even for prompting the conversation where the CTO investigates and understands the marketing plan and it faces up to some of the gaps in their knowledge about marketing. And then they start to do it. And I've found that to be a really useful tool for making that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And people are always meaning well and they work hard and try hard, but if they've never been exposed to that type of thinking or the way of talking, the way of having those conversations, it's very hard to sort of figure it out on their own. So like you coming in, or like myself coming in, or you bring in an exec from another company who then starts implementing those kind of rituals almost. COOs could be a great ally in that one. Then it helps because then people can get into that cadence, get into that rhythm. And so it's almost like the rituals around, okay, how we talk, how we actually focus on the important things, how we challenge each other. So as companies grow and, as a chief of staff, comes in, starts sort of implementing OKRs, a good one actually also starting this change management, which is the mindset shift, how we work together, how we operate, like how we sort of grow up as a company. So, and there's a lot of that sort of mindset and behavior shift that actually happens between sort of early stage to all the way through, later stage IPO, etc.
Yeah. Hey, Dora, it's coming up to time. We've talked for almost an hour, which has been wonderful. I've really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed talking to you. Before we go, if someone wanted to get in contact with you, under what circumstances would that be a good idea, and how should they do so? Like what I guess what are you doing is part of that question, but how should people, if they want?
Like been an hour. I feel like you and I can talk about these things for a very, very long time. So maybe we can do a part 2 at some point. But yeah, best thing to reach me on LinkedIn. I think that's where anyone can find me. And I'm mainly coaching founders, some C-suite sort of chief of staffs in the sort of Series B, Series C space. Last year I got a bit more involved with one startup, but I'm transitioning out. So now I'm just working with a handful of interesting companies, which is what I really love. So interesting, ambitious individuals sort of creating something remarkable. I think that's what really energizes me. So yeah, ping me on LinkedIn if you have any questions or if I can help you in any way.
So there are people who are chief of staffs, or people who are principals who might need a chief of staff but don't have one, or people who have one who need some help from an external person who's got experiences, can contact you. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Also, I have a network of chief of staff. So if you're looking to hire one, I'm happy to sort of forward any like job spec or help you with the job spec as well. So I have some good networks of chief of staffs as well.
And if someone wanted to be a chief of staff but isn't, would you help people who want to be chief of staff?
Yeah, I mean, I find, there are some really interesting, really high potential individuals that I occasionally sort of coach and help them to get the right role. Chief of staff's more, like occasional coaching. So my primary coaches are founders, CEOs, and senior executives. I don't even coach sort of junior first-time managers. I just recommend a few good books for anyone who's starting.
It's interesting. I to be honest, I'm a bit the same in terms of like working with people who are first-time managers. I think there's a huge amount to learn, but for them, and I'd love to help them. But at the same time, it just doesn't. To be honest, it's not great business because it's really hard to make a business out of coaching junior people. So and so I find that I have much more impact, and it actually works well as a business to be coaching more senior people and execs and working with the senior team. But look, thanks for your time on this. What did I want to say? I wanted to say thank you very much. And if you've been watching this, if you're watching this on the replay, or if you are watching it now and you've got a question that wasn't answered, just stick the comment in the question stick a question in the comment wherever it is, LinkedIn, YouTube, whatever you're watching. I'm sure we'll be able to find a way of getting back to you on it. But tune in next week. I'm going to have another interesting interviewee next week. I'll announce that on Wednesday. But I've got someone lined up for you. Anyway, thanks very much, Dora. Hang on the line with me. I'll end the broadcast now, but hang on the line and we'll have a quick chat afterwards. But thanks for watching, everybody. Have a great weekend.